On the 2nd of March, 2025, 8-year-old Mila Chapman and 10-year-old Amer Wilson were found in a field in Cleveland, Ohio, their lives taken far too soon. Tonight, their story. Cleveland, Ohio sits on the southern shore of Lake Erie, the fourth largest of the Great Lakes. A city that has carried within it for over 2 centuries the weight of industry, reinvention, hope, and heartbreak. A city that was once called the Forest City for its abundant trees and green spaces, and later became one of the great manufacturing capitals of the American Midwest, drawing in families from across the country and from across the world who came seeking work, stability, and a better life for their children. And even now, as the factories have quieted and the population has shifted and the skyline has changed, Cleveland remains a city of neighborhoods, a city where people know their neighbors, where children walk to school in the mornings, where families gather on porches in the warmth of summer and huddle close in the long, cold winters that roll in off the lake. And the winters in Cleveland are particularly notable, coming off Lake Erie with a force and a persistence that locals call the lake effect, bringing deep snow and flat gray skies that can stretch from November well into March. And it was in this deep winter light, in the first days of March 2025, that the city would be asked to carry a grief that even its oldest residents had rarely known. The grief of 2 children, 2 little girls, Mila Chapman, who was 8 years old, and Amer Wilson, who was 10, who were discovered in a field. And the weight of that discovery would settle over Cleveland like the lake effect. Snow settles over everything, quietly at first and then all at once, covering everything it touches. And before we come to that moment, before we sit with what was found on that cold March morning, it is important to know this city, to understand the streets these 2 girls lived on, to feel the texture of the neighborhoods they called home. Because Mila and Amer were not abstractions. They were not data points. They were children who breathed the Cleveland air, who looked up at the same gray winter sky, who had their whole futures wound up inside them like thread on a spool, waiting to be unwound into a life that was entirely their own. And Cleveland is a city with deep roots in African American history and culture, a city that was a significant stop on the Underground Railroad, a city where generations of Black families built their lives and raised their children with enormous love and enormous difficulty, navigating systems and structures that did not always serve them well. And the neighborhoods of Cleveland's East Side, where this story largely takes place, are neighborhoods of resilience and of community, of mothers and fathers doing their very best with what they have, of grandmothers watching grandchildren from front windows, of churches and corner stores that have stood for decades and that anchor the daily life of the people who live nearby. And the parks and fields scattered through these neighborhoods are places where children play in summer and where snow accumulates in winter and where ordinary mornings unfold in ways that most people never think twice about. And one such field, unremarkable in the way that most urban fields are, quiet and snow-dusted in the early March cold, would on the morning of March 2nd become the place where this story reached its most painful point. and I want you to stay with me as we move through this story slowly and carefully. The rain outside continuing to fall gently as we do. And it is worth noting that Cleveland has also long grappled with significant challenges around child welfare and the social services that are meant to protect its youngest residents. And the Cuyahoga County Department of Children and Family Services, known as CCDCFS, serves one of the most populated counties in Ohio, handling thousands of cases each year, doing work that is undeniably difficult and undeniably important. And yet, as we will come to understand in this story, there are moments when the systems meant to protect children fall short, and those moments carry consequences that cannot be undone and cannot be taken back. And the Cuyahoga River, which runs through the heart of Cleveland, was once so polluted that it literally caught fire in 1969, a moment that became a national symbol of industrial neglect and a turning point for the environmental movement. And there is something in that image, a river so damaged by neglect that it burned, that feels quietly relevant here, not as a dramatic comparison, but as a reminder that neglect in all its forms, whether environmental or institutional or personal, always has consequences. And Cleveland has spent the decades since that fire working to clean its river and reclaim its natural beauty. And the Cuyahoga today is clearer and healthier and more alive than it has been in over a century. A testament to what becomes possible when a community decides that something matters enough to protect. And that is the spirit in which we tell this story tonight. Not to alarm, not to sensationalize, but to say with full conviction that Mila Chapman and Amber Wilson mattered, that they deserved to be protected, and that their story must be told with all the care and gravity it deserves. And so we settle in, the rain falling softly outside, and we begin. Mila Chapman was 8 years old, which means she was likely in the second or perhaps the third grade. At that particular age when children are discovering the world with full hearts and wide open eyes, when they are learning to read with growing confidence, sounding out words that were mysteries only months before, when they are developing friendships that feel enormous and important and permanent, when they are beginning to understand who they are and what they love and what kind of person they want to be. And 8 is an age of imagination and of play and of possibility. An age when a child's laughter can fill an entire room, and a child's presence shapes the feeling of a household in ways that adults often only recognize after the child has gone. And Mila had a father who loved her deeply, a father named Deshaun Chapman. And though Deshaun had not been able to hold his daughter in 4 years, not through any choice of his own, the love he carried for her had not diminished at all in that time, had not faded or grown brittle or turned into something other than love, but had simply accumulated year after year into a weight he carried quietly every single day. The weight of a parent who wants nothing more than to be with his child and cannot. And there is a particular kind of grief that belongs to that specific experience. To being a father who is present in spirit but absent in proximity, who sends love into a silence that does not answer back, who waits and wonders and waits. And Deshaun had been waiting for 6 years, since Mila was barely 2 years old, trying, through whatever means were available to him, to be present in his daughter's life. and we will return to his efforts and his heartbreak shortly. But for now, let us stay with Mila herself, with who she was, an 8-year-old girl living in Cleveland, Ohio, who had her father's persistence somewhere in her, who got up every morning and put on her shoes and went about the ordinary, irreplaceable business of being a child in the world, who had things she loved and things she didn't, who had a way of smiling that was entirely her own and that no one else in the world had, and who deserved every single day of the future that was taken from her. And Amor Wilson was 10 years old, which is a different kind of childhood entirely. 10 is a threshold, the borderland between little girl and something older and more questioning. 10 is when children begin to ask harder questions about the world they live in, when they start to notice inequities and inconsistencies that younger children absorb without examination, when friendships deepen and personalities come into sharper focus, and a young person begins to understand themselves as a person distinct from their family. And Amor at 10 would have been in the 4th or 5th grade, moving through the middle years of elementary school. And like Mila, she had a father who had attempted to be present in her life. A man who, according to the account that would emerge in the days following March 2nd, had also tried to maintain a relationship with his daughter. And Amor and Mila were half-siblings, sharing a mother, connected by blood and by the particular intimacy of children who grow up inside the same household. And half-siblings often have a bond that is shaped precisely by the circumstances they share. The bond of children who navigate the same home together, who look out for each other in the quiet daily ways that children do, who share meals and mornings and evenings and all the small textures of life inside one house. And I want you to hold both of these girls in your mind as we move through this story. Mila at 8 and Amor at 10. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with that. Sit with who they were before anything happened. Sit with the fullness of their lives, with the fact that they had favorite foods and favorite things to watch and things that made them laugh in that uninhibited way that children laugh, that they had futures stretching decades ahead of them, full of possibility and change and growth and becoming, and that all of that future belonged to them by simple right, by the basic and inviolable right of being children who deserved to be safe and cared for and protected. And it is worth noting that Cleveland Public Schools serve tens of thousands of children every year. Children from all kinds of families and all kinds of circumstances. And school is often the most stable and nurturing environment that many of those children know. A place with adults who are trained to be attentive, trained to notice, trained to ask questions. And teachers in Ohio are mandatory reporters under state law, meaning that when they observe signs of abuse or neglect, they are legally required to report those observations to the appropriate authorities. And Mila and Amor would have had teachers who saw them regularly, who knew their faces and their names and something of their personalities. And this is part of the larger picture we will come to understand as we move through this story. And the rain falls, and we carry both of these girls gently forward. The household in which Mila Chapman and Amor Wilson lived was one shaped by complexity, by the kind of family dynamics that are not uncommon in communities navigating economic pressure and strained social support systems, where mothers and fathers and children move through circumstances that test even the most capable and committed adults. And Mila's father, Deshaun Chapman, has spoken publicly and with quiet courage about the years he spent attempting to be a part of his daughter's life. And his account is one that deserves to be heard carefully, because it paints a picture of a man who was not absent by choice but by circumstance. A man who was, in his own plain words, iced out, cut off from his daughter through what he describes as a sustained and deliberate effort to keep him away. And Deshaun has said that he spent 6 years trying to gain custody of Mila, that he reached out to the Child Protective Services system on numerous occasions, not once or twice, but many times over many years, that he did what a father is supposed to do when he believes his child may be in danger. He called, he reported, he asked for help. He knocked on whatever door he could find, and each time, according to his account, the system found that there was not sufficient grounds to remove the children from the home, with workers citing the presence of a physical home and a bed as evidence that the children's basic needs were being met. And this is a tension that child welfare systems across the country confront every day. The tension between a child's right to remain with their family and a child's right to be genuinely safe, between the documented harm of unnecessary removal and the documented harm of leaving a child in a dangerous environment. And it is a tension with no easy resolution and no formula that works in every case. And yet the weight of that unresolved tension falls most heavily on the children themselves, who have no vote in the process and no ability to advocate for their own safety and no language yet for what is happening to them. And Deshaun's words carry in them the particular anguish of a father who understood that something was wrong, who tried every door available to him and found each one either closed or slow to open. And his account of being told he was too family-oriented as the reason for withholding his daughter from him is one of the most arresting details in this entire story. A father's love for his family inverted and used as a justification for keeping a child away from him. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with that. And the rain outside continues to fall as we do, steadily and without urgency. And the household also contained a third child, a child who was discovered at the residence when authorities arrived to make an arrest. A child who appeared to be in good health and who was placed in the care of the Department of Children and Family Services. And this third child's presence is a reminder that the household contained other lives, other children, other futures that were also at stake. And the legal standard that child welfare workers must apply when assessing whether to remove a child from a home is a standard that is set by statute and shaped by case law and influenced by the very real trauma that unnecessary removal causes. And yet, Deshaun's 6 years of contact with CPS and the outcome of those contacts is a sequence that demands examination, demands that the system look carefully at itself and ask whether it did enough, whether it looked deeply enough, whether it listened hard enough when a father was saying his daughter was not safe. And it is also important to understand that the situation Deshaun describes of a non-custodial parent attempting to gain access to a child and being systematically blocked, is one that family courts navigate every day, and the legal pathways available to such a parent are real but slow and expensive and emotionally exhausting. And the rain falls, and we sit with the complexity of this family's circumstances before we move to what was found on the morning of March 2nd. On the morning of Monday, March 2nd, 2025, someone was walking their dog through a field in Cleveland, Ohio. An ordinary morning activity, the kind that people do without thinking too much about it. Bundled against the early March cold, moving through the quiet of a neighborhood that had not yet fully come to life. And the dog, as dogs always do, moved a little ahead of its owner, nose to the ground, following invisible trails through the cold grass and snow, alert to the world in a way that humans simply are not. And it was in this way, through the ordinary and unremarkable curiosity of an animal going about its morning, that one of the suitcases was found, sitting in the field in a way that was immediately and instinctively wrong, immediately out of place. The heaviness and stillness of it, communicating something that a person doesn't have to be trained to understand. And the person walking the dog stopped and looked and understood in the way that the body understands things before the mind has caught up. Understood that this was not something to walk past, not something to leave for someone else to deal with. And they contacted the Cleveland Division of Police. And when officers arrived at the scene and approached the suitcase and discovered what was inside, the course of this story and the course of many lives changed permanently, and a short distance away from the first suitcase, close enough that the proximity felt significant in the terrible arithmetic of what had happened. There was a second suitcase, also sitting in the field, also still, and inside that second suitcase there was the second child. And in the space of that discovery, the Cleveland Division of Police found themselves standing in a cold field with two suitcases containing two little girls, Mila Chapman and Amor Wilson. And the weight of that moment, the weight of what those first officers on the scene saw and had to process and had to carry in their bodies and in their minds, is something that we should acknowledge. Because the people who do this work, who respond to calls and find what those officers found that morning, carry those images with them for the rest of their lives, and they do not talk about it most of the time. They move through their days carrying it quietly, and the work of honoring Mila and Amor begins with acknowledging that every person who came into contact with this case was changed by it. The dog walker who made the call, the first officers to arrive, the detectives who built the case, the prosecutors who filed the charges, and the community that received the news, and the field itself, unremarkable as urban fields are, became on that morning a site of profound grief and of the beginning of a process of accountability. And it is worth pausing here to acknowledge the person who called it in, the unnamed individual who was walking their dog on an ordinary morning and who made a choice to act. Because without that call and without that choice, the discovery might have come later. And in serious criminal investigations, time matters enormously. And every hour that passes between a crime and a police response affects what evidence survives, what witnesses are available, What trails remain followable? And the Cleveland Division of Police responded with the seriousness and the urgency that this discovery demanded, sealing the area, beginning the meticulous process of evidence collection and documentation that would form the foundation of the case, calling in the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, whose work would be essential both to the families and to the prosecution and the community that surrounds that field. The neighbors who woke up that Monday morning, not yet knowing what had been found nearby, who went about the first part of their day in ordinary ways until the police tape and the news vans and the conversations in doorways told them something terrible had happened close to where they live. That community would carry its own particular grief in the days that followed. The grief of proximity, the weight of knowing that something so painful happened in a place where their own children walk and play, and the identification of the two girls as Mila Chapman, age 8, and Amor Wilson, age 10, as half-siblings connected through their shared mother, would emerge through the investigative process and through the findings of the medical examiner's office. A confirmation that added another dimension to the already enormous weight of what had been discovered. The fact that these were two children from the same household. Two children who had spent their daily lives together, who had been in the same circumstances together, and the rain outside continues to fall as we carry both of these girls forward into the investigation that followed. There were no final words from Mila or from Amor that have been publicly reported. No last statement preserved in a recording or in a document. But there is a father's voice, and that voice carries within it more weight than most formal testimony ever could. And Deshaun Chapman, Mila's father, spoke to local Cleveland media in the days following the discovery of his daughter's body. First to WJW on the condition of anonymity, and later identified by WOIO. And he did so in the rawness of a grief that had not yet had time to harden into something that could be managed. And his words are among the most quietly devastating things that have been spoken in the aftermath of this case. Words that do not perform their grief or reach for dramatic effect, but that simply state what is true in the plain language of a man who has been brought to the edge of what a person can bear. And Deshaun told WJW that he just feels useless, that he could not save his daughter. And those few words contain multitudes, contain an entire history of effort and love and frustration and failure. Not his failure, but the failure of systems that were supposed to work and did not. And the word useless is one that no parent should ever have to apply to themselves in relation to their child's safety. And yet, it is the word he reached for, because it is the truest word for how it feels to try and still not be able to prevent the thing you were trying to prevent. And he spoke about how simple it could have been. And his exact words, the words that traveled out of that interview and into the national conversation about this case, were something so simple. Just give me her. You're feeling stressed. Give me her. And in those few words, there is a whole world of restrained and patient and frustrated love. The love of a father who was not asking for grand gestures, who was not making unreasonable demands, who was simply and repeatedly saying that he was there, that he was ready, that he wanted his daughter and would have taken her and kept her safe. And the 6 years that Deshaun spent attempting to bring Mila home to him are 6 years of calls and documentation and conversations with CPS workers and family court processes and the grinding daily emotional work of trying to reach a child you cannot see through systems that were not responding to the urgency he was carrying. And he has said that CPS was contacted on numerous occasions, that each time an assessment was made, and each time the determination came back that the children were safe enough to remain where they were. And his account of being told he was too family-oriented as a justification for keeping his daughter from him is something that will stay with everyone who has heard this story, because it takes a quality, devotion to family that should be considered a strength and uses it somehow as a disqualification. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with that, with what it means for a father to be told that his love for his family is the reason he cannot be trusted with his own child. And the rain outside continues to fall softly, and we sit with Deshaun's words, with what it means to say, I don't know how long she's been gone. I don't know how long she's been dead. I don't know how long she's been missing. Because that statement contains within it the full extent of the separation that was enforced between this father and his daughter. A separation so complete that he could not know when she had last been known to be alive. And his willingness to speak publicly, to sit in front of a camera while carrying this grief and to say clearly that it could have been prevented, is itself an act of love for Mila. A father insisting that his daughter's story be told, and that the world reckon with how she came to be in that field on March 2nd. The Cleveland Division of Police launched their investigation with a seriousness and an urgency that the discovery of 2 children demanded, and that the evidence of the case confirmed was warranted. And Police Chief Dorothy Todd, in a statement shared publicly in the days following the discovery, described her detectives as having worked tirelessly and with great care. And those are not ceremonial words in this context, because the work of investigating the deaths of children requires a particular combination of technical precision and emotional endurance, a capacity to examine evidence methodically and follow every thread while carrying the knowledge of who the evidence belongs to, of who those 2 suitcases contained. And the department was careful and deliberate in what it shared with the public during the investigation, making clear through Chief Todd's statement that unlike what is often portrayed on television, not every detail of an investigation can be shared publicly, that certain information must remain confidential in order to protect the integrity of the case and to ensure that justice for the victims is not compromised by premature disclosure. And this discipline, this willingness to withstand public pressure for information in order to do the work correctly, is something worth acknowledging. Because in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, the pressure to share details in real time is enormous, and the temptation to release information prematurely is real. And the Cleveland Division of Police understood that the careful and methodical work was what Mila and Amor deserved, even if it meant saying less publicly than the public wanted to hear. And the result of that careful work was a remarkable outcome by any measure. because within 48 hours of the discovery of the two girls in that field, a person of interest had been identified, located at a residence, and taken into custody. And 48 hours from discovery to arrest in a serious homicide investigation is a timeline that reflects the quality and focus of the detective team involved. And the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office was conducting its own parallel and equally important work, examining both Mila and Amor with the thoroughness and care that such examinations require, working to determine the cause and manner of their deaths in a way that would both provide answers to the girls' families and generate evidence that would be useful to the prosecution. And the medical examiner's office also confirmed, through their examination, that Mila and Amr were half-siblings, a detail that helped establish the full picture of their shared household and their relationship to each other and to the adult in whose care they had been living. And during the execution of the warrant that led to the arrest, officers at the residence made another significant discovery: a third child who was present in the home and who appeared to be in good health. And this child was immediately placed in the care of the Department of Children and Family Services, removed from the home and taken to safety. And the presence of that third child, alive and apparently unharmed, is one of the few moments at this story that allows the breath to come a little easier before it tightens again, with the awareness of everything else that happened in that same home. And the collection of evidence from the residence would have been thorough and carefully documented, conducted under prosecutorial oversight, and designed to ensure that everything gathered would be admissible in the proceedings that would follow. And the investigation also required the painstaking work of reconstructing a timeline, of understanding when Mila and Amr were last known to be alive, when the events that led to the discovery occurred, and how much time had elapsed between those events in the morning of March 2nd. And Deshaun Chapman's statement that he does not know how long his daughter had been gone reflects the completeness of the separation that had been imposed between him and Mila, a separation so thorough that the father had no way of knowing when his daughter had last been seen by anyone. And the detectives working this case would have spent significant time and effort establishing that timeline through surveillance footage, cell phone records, witness interviews, and the physical evidence gathered at the scene and at the residence. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and acknowledge the people doing that work. The men and women who went into that field on March 2nd and who have been working carefully and relentlessly every day since to make sure that what happened to these two little girls does not go without answer. And the rain continues to fall softly outside as we move into the legal process that followed the arrest. The arrest of A.H., a 28-year-old woman, within 48 hours of the discovery of Mila and Amor's bodies, was followed by the filing of serious charges, and A.H. was charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder in connection with the deaths of the 2 girls. And it is worth understanding what this charge means under Ohio law, because legal terminology can sometimes obscure meaning rather than clarify it. And the clarity of what this charge carries matters for understanding what the state is alleging and how seriously it is taking the deaths of these two children. And under the Ohio Revised Code, specifically under Section 2903.01, aggravated murder is defined as purposely causing the death of another with prior calculation and design. And this is an important distinction from the charge of murder under Section 2903.02, which requires purposeful killing, but does not require the element of prior calculation and design, and the presence of that element in the aggravated murder charge signals the prosecutor's assessment that the killings were not impulsive acts, but involved some degree of planning or premeditation. And this matters because it shapes both the severity of the potential sentence and the narrative that the prosecution will present at trial. And the charging of A.H. with two separate counts of aggravated murder, one for Mila and one for Amor, is itself a statement about how the law views these two children as two separate individuals whose lives each carry their own full weight and whose deaths each demand their own separate accounting. And this is as it should be, because Mila Chapman and Amor Wilson were two distinct and irreplaceable people, and the legal process must reflect that. And the charges were filed through the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, which holds jurisdiction over criminal cases arising within Cuyahoga County. And the process that follows an arrest in Ohio includes an initial appearance before a judge, a formal arraignment at which charges are read and a plea is entered, and then the long process of pretrial hearings, discovery, and ultimately trial, a process that can extend over many months and that will require the families of Mila and Amor to remain engaged with the legal system during a period when they are simultaneously trying to grieve. And this ongoing demand is one of the largely invisible burdens carried by the families of homicide victims. The way that justice requires presence and participation from people who are already carrying almost more than a person can carry. And in Ohio, a conviction on charges of aggravated murder can result in a sentence of life imprisonment. And in cases involving child victims, the sentencing considerations available to a judge include enhanced penalties that reflect the particular vulnerability of children as victims. And the presumption of innocence is a cornerstone of the American criminal justice system, and one that we acknowledge here as we discuss the charges against A.H., while also holding clearly and without apology the truth of what was found in that field on March 2nd, and the names of the two little girls who were found there. And Ohio also provides victim advocacy and support services for families navigating the criminal justice system, services that exist precisely because the legal process was not designed with the needs of grieving families in mind, and because families need support and guidance and a steady hand to get through the months and years that a major criminal prosecution can require. And the case against A. Elm is being built carefully, and the commitment expressed by Chief Dorothy Todd to achieving justice for Mila and Amor is one that the community of Cleveland has taken to heart. The news of what had been found in that Cleveland field spread quickly, first through local media and then outward through national outlets and across social media platforms. And WJW and WOIO, Cleveland's local television news stations, were among the first to carry the story and to seek out the people most directly connected to it. And Deshaun Chapman spoke to both stations, initially requesting anonymity and then allowing his name to be used. And his words traveled beyond Cleveland to reach national publications, including People magazine and ABC News. And the response to those words, to his interviews, and to the details of what had happened to Mila and Amor, was one of widespread grief and of a particular kind of anger, the anger that belonged specifically to preventable loss, the anger that is different from the anger that follows random tragedy because it carries within it the additional weight of what might have been done differently. And social media carried the story with the speed that social media always carries stories that touch something deep in people. And the posts and the comments and the shares represented a genuine and widespread public grieving. A community of strangers who did not know Mila or Amor personally, but who were struck fully by the weight of what their story contained, who looked at the ages 8 and 10 and could not keep from thinking of the children in their own lives, their daughters and nieces and neighborhood kids and students, the children they are responsible for and the children they love, and the national conversation that emerged in the days following March 2nd touched on child welfare and the limits of the Child Protective Services system and the rights and the frustrations of non-custodial parents and the question of what it means when a father says repeatedly that his daughter is not safe and the system responds that she has a home and a bed and that is enough. And Police Chief Dorothy Todd's statement, measured and professional and clear about both the competence of her team and the ongoing nature of the investigation, was widely shared and generally received as evidence that the Cleveland Division of Police had taken this case with the seriousness it deserved. And the 48-hour arrest timeline was noted publicly as a marker of real and focused police work. And the community of Cleveland gathered in the aftermath of this story in the way communities gather around shared grief, looking for ways to make sense of what had happened, and looking for ways to ensure that the names of these two little girls would not be forgotten as the news cycle moved on to the next story, as it always does. And the rain falls, and we sit with that grief and with the national conversation that Mila and Amor's story opened. A conversation that must be sustained long after the cameras have moved on. One of the most meaningful things we can do in telling the story of Mila Chapman and Amor Wilson, beyond honoring who they were and bearing witness to what happened to them, is to speak clearly and practically about child protection, about what individuals and communities can do when they believe a child is in danger. Because if any purpose can be drawn from a tragedy of this kind, it must be the purpose of preventing the next one. And the Child Protective Services system in Ohio and across the country operates within a framework of laws and professional standards that are genuinely designed to balance two things that can sometimes pull against each other: the preservation of families and the safety of children. And both of those values are real, and both of them matter. And child welfare, workers carry caseloads that would overwhelm most people and make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and with legal standards that require a specific threshold of evidence before a child can be removed from their home. And they are human beings doing extraordinarily difficult work in an underfunded system. And none of that changes the fact that in this case a father was raising alarms repeatedly, and the outcome was the one we know. And Deshaun Chapman's account of being told the children were safe because they had a home and a bed is a reminder that the visible markers of adequacy can obscure invisible realities of danger. That a household can appear to meet basic standards while containing something that the standards do not capture. And this is why the warning signs of abuse and neglect matter so much. Why understanding them is important for every adult who is in regular contact with children. And those warning signs include unexplained changes in a child's physical appearance or injuries that don't have clear explanations, significant shifts in behavior or mood or social engagement, a child who seems fearful around certain adults or who flinches at sudden movement, a child who is frequently absent from school or who comes to school hungry or inadequately dressed for the weather, a child who makes statements that suggest something troubling is happening at home, and neighbors can see these signs. Teachers who spend hours with children every day are often the first to notice when something is wrong. Coaches and mentors and relatives and family friends all have the capacity to notice and to act. And in Ohio, under Ohio Revised Code Section 2151.421, mandatory reporters, a category that includes teachers, school counselors, doctors, nurses, social workers, law enforcement officers, and many other professionals who work with children, are legally required to report suspected child abuse or neglect to the appropriate authorities. And the standard for reporting is not certainty, but reasonable suspicion, which is a deliberately accessible threshold because the law understands that reporters are not investigators and should not be expected to reach conclusions before making a call. And a report can be made to the Cuyahoga County Department of Children and Family Services directly, or through the Ohio Child Abuse Reporting System. And for anyone anywhere in the country, the National Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, reachable at 1-800-4-A-CHILD, which translates to 1-800-422-4453, is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and provides crisis intervention and information and referrals to local child welfare resources. And reporting a concern about a child is not an act of betrayal, and it is not an overreaction, and it is not meddling in someone else's business. It is an act of care for a child who cannot advocate for themselves. And if you are a non-custodial parent who is concerned about a child's safety, there are legal pathways available, including filing for emergency custody modification through family court when you believe a child is in imminent danger. And legal aid organizations in most cities can help navigate that process, even for people without financial resources. And the conversation that this case has opened must not close again when the news moves on, must instead translate into policy review and practice change, and better resourcing for child welfare systems that are asked to do more than they are given the capacity to do. And somewhere tonight, there is a child who needs someone to notice. And the rain falls, and we carry that awareness gently with us as we move toward the close of tonight's story. Mila Chapman was 8 years old, and Amor Wilson was 10, and they are gone now. And the world that remains after them is smaller for their absence, quieter in ways that cannot fully be explained to anyone who has not felt the removal of a child's presence from a space that the child occupied. And the tribute that these two girls deserve is not a monument or a trending hashtag or a moment of silence, though all of those things have their place and their meaning. The tribute they truly deserve is something more lasting and more difficult, something that lives in the choices that adults make about how they treat the children in their care, in the choices that communities make about how seriously they receive the voices of parents who are saying their child is not safe, in the choices that institutions make about what standards they apply and what weight they give to a father's repeated calls about his daughter. And Deshaun Chapman's voice is the voice that speaks most directly to what is owed to Mila and to children like her. His willingness to sit in front of a camera while carrying a grief so fresh it had barely formed into something he could hold, and to say clearly that it could have been prevented, that it was something so simple, is an act of love and of public accountability simultaneously. A father refusing to let his daughter's death become an unanswered question or a buried statistic. And Mila deserved to grow up. She deserved to pass through the 3rd grade and the 4th and every grade beyond, to grow into her own opinions and her own style and her own understanding of who she was and what she wanted. She deserved to discover what she was good at and to pursue it. She deserved ordinary days and extraordinary ones. She deserved the long, ordinary future that was hers by right. And Amor deserved exactly the same. Deserved to cross from 10 into the teenager she was becoming. Deserved to discover her voice and her independence, and the particular pleasure of beginning to understand yourself as a person separate from the family that made you. And the loss of a child is the loss of a future that extends not just years, but decades. And it ripples outward in ways that can never be fully measured through everyone who would have known them, the teachers they would have had and learned from, the friends they would have made and kept for years, the people they might someday have loved, the children they might themselves have had, and all of that potential, all of that future that was wound up inside an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old in Cleveland, Ohio, is gone now. And we should let the weight of that sit for a moment, without trying to resolve it or move past it too quickly. And Cleveland will carry Mila and Amor in its collective memory. And the question of what could have been done differently should not be allowed to fade or to be pushed aside by the urgency of the next crisis. Because the honest and sustained engagement with that question is the only thing that might protect a child who is alive right now and who is also in a household where something is wrong. And there are organizations in Ohio and across the country that work every day on behalf of children who cannot speak for themselves. Organizations like Child Help and the Children's Defense Fund and the Ohio Children's Alliance and local advocacy groups that are embedded in communities and that understand the particular needs of families navigating poverty and systemic barriers and the gaps in social services, and supporting that work is one of the most concrete ways that the names of Mila Chapman and Amor Wilson can be carried forward into something that matters. And I want you to pause here for just a moment and sit with both of these girls one more time. Mila at 8, with her whole life folded up inside her, and Amor at 10, standing at the edge of something new and as yet unwritten. And I want you to hold them gently, not as victims, not as a news story, not as a cautionary tale, but as the children they were, as two human beings who had names and faces and futures, and who deserved every single day of the lives that were taken from them. And the rain outside continues to fall softly as we sit with them. And there is a concept in the philosophy of education about the importance of imagining otherwise, of cultivating the capacity to see beyond what is to what might be. And in the context of this story, imagining otherwise means imagining a world in which Deshaun Chapman's calls were met with urgency, in which the system said, "We hear you, and we will look more carefully," in which the chain of events that led to that field on March 2nd was interrupted at any one of its many possible points. And imagining otherwise is not a fantasy or an indulgence in hindsight. It is the fundamental work of systems that want to improve. The work of asking what we would need to do differently to get a different outcome. And the legal process now underway. The charges filed. The investigation ongoing. The medical examiner's work continuing. Represents the beginning of accountability. And accountability is not the same as restoration. It cannot return Mila or Amor. It cannot give Deshaun Chapman his daughter back or undo the 4 years of silence between them. But it is what justice looks like within the limits of what the world is able to offer. And we receive it, imperfect as it is, as the best available response to something that should never have happened and that must not be allowed to simply happen again. And so we arrive at the end of tonight's story. And we arrive here with Mila Chapman and Amor Wilson still present in our minds and in our hearts. Two little girls from Cleveland, Ohio, who mattered enormously, whose lives had infinite worth, and whose story deserved to be told slowly and carefully and with complete respect. And we have tried tonight to do that, to move through their story with the care that they deserve. And I want you now to let your body settle a little more fully into wherever you are resting, to feel the weight of this evening releasing gently, slowly, from your shoulders and from your chest, to hear the rain outside, the rain that has been falling softly through this entire story, continuous and steady and unhurried, and to know as you rest that the world is carrying this story forward, that there are detectives and prosecutors and advocates and reporters and a grieving father who are all carrying it forward on behalf of Mila and Amor, and that the names of these two children will not be forgotten, not by the people who loved them, and not by the people who heard their story tonight. And I will be here tomorrow night with another story, told at this same pace, with this same care, and you do not have to carry all of this right now. You can set it down gently and let it rest beside you, and the rain will stay with you as you sleep, falling softly and steadily as it has been falling all evening. And Mila Chapman was 8 years old, and she mattered. And Amor Wilson was 10 years old, and she mattered. And they are remembered. And you can rest now, gently and peacefully, and the rain will continue to fall through the night, and tomorrow will come, and I will be here.